Okay, let's start talk a little bit about yesterday is the 104th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. Um, can we
Oh,
say
right.
Communist Party of China is one of the most successful parties in modern history because it started with 13 members. I think it started with 15 members, and the first meeting they had,
Yeah.
they only had the 13 representatives representing 50 members. And today they have 98 million, getting close to 100 million members in China, and they totally transformed
Mhm.
China. So, can we say that it is a very successful party?
Very successful party. I think that is a magnificent understatement. I think that it has transformed not just China, but the world, and
Mm.
is continuing to
Yeah.
do so still. Its impact on China, of course, has been colossal. I mean, it's important perhaps to remember the state of China in, was it 1919 when,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
or was it 1921?
Yeah.
But when it was established, I mean, we're talking about a situation where there'd been um, constant crisis in China
Hmm.
since about the 1840s. I mean, it had been a deteriorating situation, but the dynasty steadily lost control. It became increasingly corrupt. It was then attacked by the Western powers. As we know, there was incredible predatory actions by the Western powers, what even the British called the Opium Wars. I don't know what it's called in China, but I mean, the
Yeah.
fact that they're called the Opium Wars in Britain tells you how
Hmm.
disgraceful that whole episode was. Then there was, of course, wars of aggression, incredibly cruel wars of aggression waged against China by the Japanese in the
Hmm.
late 19th century. They extended their influence over China as well. Then the dynasty finally collapsed in the revolution that happened in 1911. But as the Chinese people, of course, know, the Chinese Revolution was then usurped by General Yuan Shikai,
Hmm.
who declared himself president of China and then tried to form his own dynasty and was deeply corrupt as well and was, to all intents and purposes, I don't know whether this is known in China, but he was essentially an agent of the British. I mean, he was
Uh-huh.
basically there to do exactly what the British were telling him to do. And
Hmm.
then he led China into the First World War on the British behalf. He let China lose control of its western and northern regions. There was a period of unbelievable economic misery and corruption in China at that time. I mean, if you read accounts of the state of China at this time, when the Communist Party of China was established, it is unbearable.
Hmm.
Then there was the unbelievable savage treatment of China by the Western powers at the Versailles Treaty Conference, when China, was an ally during the First World War, but was basically excluded from the conference and
Yeah.
continued to be divided up amongst the
Yeah.
Western powers. Then that finally caused the Chinese people to start their protests. There was the protests in 1919, which I think we discussed in an
Yeah.
earlier program. And then
Mm.
eventually, firstly, we had, um, the Kuomintang, which is at that time led by Sun Yat-sen, start to, lead some kind of pushback. And then also we had the Communist Party of China finally established. And then, of course, it's important to say this, the situation in China actually continued to get worse
Hmm.
because Sun Yat-sen was very successful in reuniting China, but his successor, General Chiang Kai-shek, was a monster of corruption.
Hmm.
And where Yuan Shikai had been doing what the British told him, Chiang Kai-shek basically did what the Americans told him. And then the Japanese attacked again, and Chiang Kai-shek abdicated all responsibility in terms of his leadership of China at that time. And it fell to the Communist Party to to lead the Chinese people in resisting Japanese aggression. And then eventually, to achieve the country's liberation and its full reunification and the end of warlordism in the 1940s. And then to lead China on a path of extraordinary economic and industrial development and social and material development also, and cultural reorganization. There were many difficult times. In the first 20 years, very serious mistakes were made, given the scale of the challenge. Arguably, I mean, it couldn't have been otherwise. I am a person, by the way, who still has a broadly sympathetic view of Mao Zedong. Whom I remember, by the way, I should say. And I mean, given what he achieved, which is astonishing. And of course, since the 1970s, as I said, we have seen China reestablish itself as one of the leading nations, not just one of the leading nations, was one of the two leading nations of the world. And the Chinese people recover their confidence. And China, even the Financial Times today, is admitting a stabilized economy, growing rapidly, perhaps the world's technological leader. As I said, it changed the world. So I've only given a very short summary of its history. I've not wasted any time with its internal conflicts, which are of no interest to me at all, by the way. I'm really not interested in any of that. I know some people write books on this. I can't understand why, to be honest. The reality, if you look at the arc of its history, if you look at its achievements, if you look at the kind of things that they did, I mean, the long march, everything else that has happened since. I mean, it has been absolutely astonishing. I mean, it is an epic story leading to the epic rise of a great country, which, by the way, in the 1920s in the West was no longer even thought of as a country anymore. I mean, it was a kind of practically thought of as a future colony, and sometimes talked about as a civilization, but as never anything more than that, a civilization which the Westerners largely despised.
When I took my son to go to China this time, he had a question. We went to several cities. So he had a question I thought interesting. He asked me, he said, do you think China, Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping, who has the more influence on China? Because one thing you can see, especially if you go to Shanghai and Shenzhen, those places, he think, today's China is definitively Deng Xiaoping's China. What do you think?
I think it's Mao Zedong's China, and I'm going to say this, and I think Deng Xiaoping would have agreed. It's important to say this. Deng Xiaoping had his issues with Mao. I mean, he was in and out of favor, various times. As I said, I'm not personally very interested in the internal politics of all of this, but I can absolutely remember that at no time when he became China's paramount leader in the 1980s did he ever say that Mao had not been instrumental in achieving and creating the framework upon which Deng Xiaoping himself built. And, he never at any point in time argued otherwise. I think the greatest achievement of all, the thing that was the foundational one, without which nothing else could have been achieved, was that which the party under Mao's leadership achieved between the 1930s and the 1940s, when, as I said, they finally brought China together. What was that speech that Mao made? The Chinese people, it's time for them to stand up, or something like that. You probably know the words, the famous words that he made on the occasion of the foundation of the People's Republic. So, and I think this is right. And I think everything that's happened is built on that. Now, I think Mao had, I do believe this. I think he had great organizational gifts. I think, however, he was the person who needed to lead the party and the Chinese people through the great crisis of the 30s and 40s and 50s as well. I think that thereafter, this is what they say: 70% good, 30% bad. I don't, by the way, agree with any of that, but I think that he was formed in that revolutionary period, and that beyond a certain point, what China needed was a person who was more a builder. And I think Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun, by the way, who
Chen Yuan,
I
yeah.
know people talk about a lot in China, absolutely, who hardly ever gets mentioned in the West today, were people who needed to come in to build on all of those foundations and to repair some of the damage that Mao himself did. But as I said, you have to ultimately say to yourself, would there have been a Deng Xiaoping or a Chen Yun without the Communist Party? And would the Communist Party have been what it became without Mao's leadership? Mao was not the party's first leader.
No.
I mean, one mustn't separate Mao from the party. But, at that absolutely critical moment, he was needed. And I think in the end, that must make him the greater man. Now, as I said, maybe people in China will push back on that. I don't want to be the person. I'm not writing China's history. I mean, I want to make this absolutely clear. I think one of the worst colonial practices that the West has, one of the most insidious things they do, is that they give themselves to the right to write the history of other nations. And I think that is a terrible thing. And I especially think that makes no sense at all with China, of all places. But I can express my own opinions, and those are mine. I remember Chairman Mao, as we always used to call him, and I remember Deng Xiaoping. I found both men extremely impressive, but I still think in the end, the epochal figure was Mao.
Yeah,
I remember Zhou Enlai as well, by the way, who I also have a massive respect for.
Yeah, I think probably most Chinese people agree with you. Yeah, Mao has a lot of respect in China. Yes, he laid the foundation. I mean, despite all his mistakes during the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, and what have you, by the time Deng Xiaoping opens up China, Chinese populations, like a life expectancy, increased dramatically, and then literacy level increased dramatically. So those are good foundations for Deng Xiaoping to start, pushing forward his reform, So, yeah.
And China is a united country. It has
Mm-hmm.
already certain strong industries. It has an administration that means that what is decided in Beijing will be listened to, and people will act on it in every region of the country. These are not small things. These are enormous things. Those are the things that China lost during this century of humiliation. And obviously, it required an extraordinary movement. And I'm not saying that Mao played the only role. Extraordinary movement, but also an extraordinary person to lead that movement, to bring it all back together again in the way that was done.
Yeah. I mean, the literacy level. So there are people, public education improves significantly. Yeah. Okay. All right. The trade war. So China and US, it seems like they signed a trade deal, but we don't know the detail. I can't find much details. But the fact that Trump didn't make this such a big deal, doesn't that tell us something that he probably didn't get much out of this deal? Can we say that?
It tells us everything. It tells us absolutely everything. My own guess is that the trade deal is essentially what was agreed in Geneva a few weeks ago. They decided that they would keep that permanent, and I think that suits China very well. China has won this round, absolutely. I mean, completely. There is no other way to discuss or describe this. Remember how they were saying at one point that it was all a clever the tariffs that they were imposing on all sorts of countries were all a clever way of isolating China in order to force it into massive concessions. Well, what became of all of that? And Trump now wants to go to China to meet his great friend Xi Jinping.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
quite interesting. But I mean, China won. I mean, there's just no two ways about it.
And in terms of other countries, at one point in April, Peter Navarro, he said that they are going to do 90 deals in 90 days. So we are now in that 90-day period now. I mean, we are at the, in the 90 days. I don't think they got much deal. I think the latest, according to Lutnick, he said that they're going to top 10 deals. So in that sense, it's not just this trade war against China, but overall, can we say what Trump was trying to do has failed?
Yeah, it was a flop. It was a complete flop. I mean, the one thing he has done is that he's increased tariffs across the board
Mhm.
10%. And, that is something. Now, if he'd just done that and stuck with it, he would have been in a strong position to say, well, I've changed the direction and balance of US
Mhm.
trade policy. What the eventual economic results would have been is another matter, but he would have been able to say, that I've achieved this thing. But of course, he didn't. He went for so-called retaliatory tariffs. He did all of that. He talked about all the great trade deals he was going to sign.
Mhm.
uh, we've had one with Britain, which is a nonsense deal. And the most important deal by far is with China, and he won't even tell us what it is. So I mean that tells you where we really are.
Yeah. Now, of course, other than the deal itself, I think he still or people around him, I don't know, they're still trying to get to China somehow because they report that I just saw that there is some criminal charges against Huawei, and the judge ruled that China must, the Huawei must go to trial because Huawei was trying to get those charges dismissed. Now, part of it is it's supposedly money laundering related to the sanction against Iran and stuff like that. Now, that actually is part of the reason Meng Wanzhou was kidnapped. Now, after she came back to China, so the expectation is all those charges should be dropped, but apparently not. At least the one judge is saying that the Huawei must have faced criminal charges in the court. So you see, they're still trying. This is the case brought by the Justice Department, which is Trump's Justice Department. And also another thing is Trump claimed that TikTok has a buyer, but TikTok always had buyers. That's not the problem. The problem is China doesn't approve it. But nonetheless, it seems like they are still trying to do something to hurt China. Don't you think?
Well, absolutely. I don't think that's changed at all. I mean, they tried the economic wall uh, option, but it failed. Um, but they still haven't overcome their visceral hostility to China. I mean, it is still there.
Mhm.
So, they're still hounding TikTok. They're still hounding Huawei.
Huawei,
They're still trying to complete the robbery of TikTok because that's what it was. They will do more things.
Mhm.
It's now, I'm afraid, a structural policy within the US. I mean, the things I read about China every day in the media is just, I mean, it's horrifying,
Mhm.
actually. And, the extraordinary thing about it is they pick fights with China, which they then lose. The tariff war was a massive loss. But then instead of learning from that, they just go ahead and pick another fight.
Yeah, yeah. They would never stop. Yeah. And I mean, the main thing, I'm here living in the United States. I really think the most important thing for Trump and for the US government is to focus domestically, right? There is a lot of problem within the US. So the latest one is this big beautiful bill. Some people call it the big billionaire bill because
Yeah.
it's almost doing exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do. On the one hand, they are increase the spending, and the spending is not really benefiting the public, but increase spending on military. And then they cut taxes for the rich, which means lower the income for the government. So you get less money coming in, but you spend more. So clearly, it's going to be a huge deficit for the next 10 years. And it's hurting the most vulnerable. They're cutting Medicaid and Medicare to the degree that lots of Republicans are revolting now. I mean, even though it passed to the Senate, but the House, there are quite a few Republican members are not happy with it. So you see, that's what this big, beautiful bill is doing. And my question is, why is Trump doing that? Doesn't he know that this is not the best approach? He should know.
Well, you would have thought so.
Yeah.
And you would also think that he has some understanding that this
Mhm.
is something that his electoral base
Yeah.
are not going to like in the end when they understand properly what it means. I suspect the trouble with Trump is that he is, like so many people, especially rich people, a prisoner of conventional Western economic thinking, which is that the way that you increase productivity is by giving rich people more money,
Uh-huh.
because that will motivate them to work harder. And the way you get poor people to increase their productivity is by taking money from them, because that will force them to work harder. I think this is very much the sort of deep down the thinking that he and, as I said, many of the billionaire class, and certainly many of their friends in Britain have.
Well, you see, that's part of the problem with the Western style electoral democracy. So now the Democrats are talking about, of course, the Democrats are very much against this bill, together with some Republicans. And then, of course, the public sentiment is that I think that the number is like more than half of the Americans absolutely disagree with this
Yeah.
bill, and even within the Republicans. So it is quite possible the midterm next year that they're going to lose some seats. The Republican Party will lose some seats. But the problem is that even let's say that is the case, that the Republican Party suffered from it. It's already done. The deal is, I think
Yeah.
eventually they will still get it, and then the bill is in place. So
Yes.
it's always like the order is wrong, right? That it's already
Yeah.
happened, and then you punish somebody saying, okay, we don't like this. And it's always, I also find that in the United States, it's always hard to redo something. Once something, is in place, become a law, it's very hard to cancel it, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, Trump's first term tax cuts were never
Hmm.
reversed. I mean,
No,
Biden never reversed them.
no.
He increased spending, but he didn't reverse them. And it's the same is exactly the same is going to happen here. As you absolutely rightly say, it's now going to become part of the economic and political architecture of the United States. And it's impossible to change anything
Mhm.
around it in the United States. I have to say, I had some hopes when Trump became president, but with every week that passes, it seems to me the prospects are getting bleaker. I mean, there are still some good impulses coming out of the administration in a few areas, but when you look at the overall direction, both in foreign and domestic policies, it seems to me that it's just reverting to norms, which is, benefit the rich, tax the poor, hit the poor, take away such social provisions, limited social provisions, as the United States has, completely mess up economic policy, completely mess up. I mean, the United States doesn't have economic policies, not really. I mean, it has tax policies to help rich people, and that's really about it. And deregulation is about making a few people in Wall Street even richer. But this is not really a policy in the way that, to go back to the things we were discussing at the start of our program, the Communist Party of China and the government of China has economic policies. You could see that, with the so-called Chips Act, which never
Mhm.
produced any chips, and the infrastructure that was going to create all those, points for electric cars, which never built a single one. I mean, you move large sums of money around, but you never sit down and really work out how to make it work. I've just been looking at this, this is Ukraine related thing about increasing production of artillery shells, which they were going to do for the war in Ukraine. Artillery shells have not changed very much since the beginning of the 20th century. So we're talking about amongst the most simple things to make. And they were going to produce 100,000 shells a month, which is a fraction of what Russia is producing. And I'm not even going to start on what China can produce. But they couldn't sort out the factory to do even that. They had to import machine tools from Turkey. They had to import the workers from Turkey. They couldn't get the supply chains running. They couldn't get the steel together. I mean, nothing was organized. So there was a small bump upwards, and now apparently shell production is declining again because there is no means to organize production efficiently for anything in the United States anymore. And can I just say, I mean, whatever criticisms people make of Elon Musk, and you can make many, he is the only person I know in the United States over the last 10 years since Steve Jobs died who has actually managed to produce any industrial products at all, because he's have any understanding of how to organize manufacturing and industrial chains and those kind of things. And what happens? He's being banished into the outer darkness. I mean, he's sort of being promoted. I mean, you read every so often, for example, about how the government in China sometimes has its criticisms and has its quarrels with, business people, industrialists, Jack Ma and things like that. Look at what's just been done to Elon Musk. And he is far more central to any possibility of an industrial and manufacturing revival in the United States than any single one businessman is in China. China would never allow one individual to become as important to its industrial structure as Elon Musk has become important to the American. But even then, the Americans are turning against him.
Part of the problem, I find that, just observing, right, that I find that there's too much emphasis on election by itself. So a few years ago, I went to a Democratic Party meeting, local chapter meeting, out of curiosity. So I thought, where I live, the Democrat has a very solid grasp on this area. So they don't really need to worry too much about the local election because it's always Democrats who wins. So I thought they would be talking about managing, the problems, the local problems, like there's some roads problems. And of course, there's always the problem like real estate developers developing properties that there's locals that are against, or maybe building a Walmart, stuff like that. So it's just like very, very concrete problems we have. So as a resident here, I thought I want to listen to what they're thinking. The first we got in there, they're just introducing different people, okay? And then everybody coming and talking about, my name, and then I'm running for, this is for the next election. I thought that would be like maybe 30 minutes. And after that, we should talk about the real thing. No, they keep on going and going. The whole meeting was about that. There was not a single word talking about local issues. I was really surprised. So
no, I'm not. I've experienced the same exactly in Britain, and I think I've discussed that I'm in contact with Dominic Cummings, who was the campaign person who carried out, who played a big role in Brexit, and he's an interesting man, and he talks about how many things are wrong. And he says that one of the problems in Britain, and it's the same in the United States and in the West, is that it's always about process and never about outcome.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely right about that. And then I say this, and I've said, it's not a secret. He won't be annoyed with me because I'm saying this here. The point, my criticism of him is that he's only always about process, never about outcome. I mean, he's constantly saying, we need to improve this structure, that structure. We need to have more people that, looking at these, but he never actually comes up with, how are we going to actually achieve X or Y? How are we going to build up factories to do this, or how are we going to integrate Britain into sorting out proper internet, for example, which is such a huge problem here. That sort of topic never gets discussed anywhere in the West anymore. I mean, it's just like we've basically given up doing that. It's very strange.
Yeah, my mayor, before her election, when I was talking to her about we need a culture center here, for people who have to have a place to do some different crafts or practice, like a choir, children's choir, or, a place for people who can do those kind of a hobby thing. Right now, we don't have one. People just struggle to find the locations to do whatever. And she showed a lot of interest, and there was even an article about it on our local newspaper. After she was elected, I was trying to contact her about that. She did refuse to even meet me. She just, I mean, so,
there is a huge amount of activity in the political systems of the West. There's no action. I mean, the two are not the same. I mean, there is constant activity. But you see this. I worked I've told you, in the legal civil service, in effect, in Britain, and I saw it there too. I mean, the number of people who were actually doing something was tiny.
yeah.
I mean, in my office, I was the only person who was doing anything. And I remember counting, I had about 40 people above me who were each sending me different things that they wanted me to do, but wanted reports that they were insisting that I spent much of my time simply writing reports, I remember.
Yeah.
But I mean, none of it ever achieved any sort of outcome. And this is how we become.
We'll see. I mean, I don't know what to do, because they will continue to do that. They're both parties, because there was a guy I also met in that meeting on our way out. He used to be a Republican, so he became a Democrat. So he came for the meeting. So I asked him about that. I said, is this the way the Republicans are? He said it's worse. So what can I
Sure.
say?
Well, you see, this is one of the things that again, let's go back to our discussion at the start of the program about the Communist Party of China, which is that it is rooted in society in a way that parties and political movements in the West no longer are. Parties and political movements in the West, as we've discussed many times, have become self-sustaining, independent entities that float above society. The people who are involved in them are involved in them. They are not actually in contact with anyone else beyond that sort of political bubble. Whereas, I'm not going to pretend I'm very familiar with the way in which the system works in China, but I get the sense that people in China, in order to rise, you have to have involvement in factories, in schools, in offices, in running things in cities, in getting the cities working. So you get that experience of managing people, managing projects, being successful at managing projects, and you gradually build up that experience and the confidence that goes with the experience. And at the same time, that sense of contact and relationship with people, which you can never acquire in the abstract, however well educated and sophisticated a person you might think you are. And I think this is a fundamental difference. One of the things I've noticed, by the way, about the leadership in China is that in the West, we like to go for very, very young people. Whereas in China, this isn't so. They're not enormously old, but they are people with backstories. I mean, they're people who, usually in their 50s and whatever, who've seen a lot and done much, as I said, have worked their way up. And I think that makes for an enormous difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Japanese media, they report that China plans to invite Trump to attend the military parade for the 80th anniversary of the victory in the War of Resistance in September. And then in the meantime, the Western media has been, at least not officially, but they're reporting saying that Trump is preparing for a visit to China, supposedly bring with him a big delegation. Now, the Chinese foreign minister spokesperson, when was asked about this, her answer was, yeah, we are preparing for the celebration of that. Other than that, there's nothing more I can say. So, so she's not denying it. And of course, as you can see, Japan's very sensitive about this because Putin already said he's coming. So
Yeah.
if Trump comes, that would be a very significant event, isn't it?
Oh, a huge event. And by the way, I noticed that Ushakov, who was Putin's foreign policy aide,
Mhm.
said that this a meeting between Putin and Trump might eventually happen in the autumn.
Okay.
Could it be that they're thinking maybe that the place that they will finally meet is in China? Now, that would be an extraordinary thing. But anyway, just to say, but one can't escape the sense also that Trump is gate crashing the party a bit.
Yeah. And we will see whether he goes because there will be.
I mean, I hope he does. And I'll tell you
Yeah.
this, I think it would be a good thing for him to go. First of all, it would restore a sense finally that these were the three countries that together united to fight fascism and militarism
Yeah.
in the Second World War. So I think there is an appropriate thing about the three leaders of these countries, the big three coming together again in that kind of a way. So I think that would be a good thing. And it would be an important signal to countries like Germany, Japan, other places around the world as well. And of course, there is so much for Trump to talk about with Xi Jinping, and there are plenty of things that he must talk about with Putin. And I think meeting in China is probably just about the best place for that to happen. And well, quite apart from anything else, he would see how a military parade is actually done.
And also, I think Trump himself probably liked the fact that if he brings this big, huge delegations and they sign some deals, that would be something he could talk a lot about. That's pretty much fit into, so it would be a good thing for him, I think.
Yes. I think so. I hope he does it. And I would welcome it if it happened. As I said, I don't think that this is an idea that came from China, but it's probably Trump's own. As I said, it's the sort of, I said sometimes he does come up with good impulses.
Yeah.
This would be one, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And he likes the attention. Now, this event would definitely got all the attention he wants. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Cambodia and Thailand have some dispute, which not widely reported. People in the West don't pay attention to this, but nonetheless, it's kind of interesting. A lot of talks in China about that. The Thailand's prime minister now is suspended because of the leaked phone call he had with Cambodia leader Hong Shen. So Thailand in general is a country that the civilian government is not fully in control of its military, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah. And it's not unusual. I think Cambodia also has a royal family as well, but it seems like Cambodia's prime minister or the leaders, they do have more independence from the family. The Thailand royal family, they seem to line up with their military. Isn't that where the problem is?
I think so. I think that the political systems are actually different in the sense that I think that the Cambodian monarchy has never really recovered from the crisis of the 1970s, when in 1970 well, first of all, I mean, the king of Cambodia abdicated in the 60s, made himself prime minister, ran Cambodia through elections. He was then overthrown in a coup in 1970, ended up first in China and then in North Korea, by the way, but was always a friend of China's, just to say, Norodom Sihanouk. But I don't think they've ever established the same kind of authority in Cambodia that they had before. So I think Hun Sen does, in fact, mostly run things in Cambodia. Thailand has an extraordinarily complicated political system in the sense that there are elections, there are political factions, but power is really exercised in a completely different and far more opaque way through the palace, through the military, through all sorts of powerful figures behind the scenes. And it's never quite easy to understand who is in control and what is going on.
Yeah, and this phone call is very strange because they had this big dispute, border dispute. It's about this temple. And then not only that, but around the temple, there's some territories now recently, maybe not that recent, discovered some rare earth. So rare earth is always the problem now, wherever you look. So they discovered some rare earth. Of course, that become a much more tension because the rare earth thing, and on top of the religious temple thing. And so the Thailand Prime Minister Shinawatra, she actually called the Hun Sen, and basically a private phone call. The two families get along very well, so she called him dad, uncle, or something, and then talked. Somehow that phone call got leaked by Hun Sen. Why did he do that? It just that created problems for the current, I guess, crisis for Thailand. So again, we talk about political leaders. It's very important to political leaders to build trust. So Hun Sen in this case absolutely betrayed the trust, right? So it's not just West leaders. In Cambodia, he betrayed trust as well. It's a private phone call. Why did he leak it, right?
Well, who knows? I mean, he has a very, as I'm sure you know, he has a very complex history. I mean, he started essentially as an agent of the Vietnamese, I remember, and then he consolidated control in Cambodia. And I'm not going to I'm not here to criticize him. I mean, he no doubt did achieve a stabilization of the situation in Cambodia eventually. But as I said, he's a complex man, and he's probably got all kinds of reasons of his own, which I'm not really in a position to decipher. I wonder, I'm right in thinking that Thailand is seeking to join the BRICS, isn't it, or something of that kind? Whether there isn't something going on around that, actually, that this is really what this is all about, and that Hun Sen might be angling now for American support or something of that kind. I'm not going to pretend I know a lot about this quarrel. I was aware of it, but I hadn't followed it in detail. But when I heard about it, I said to myself, this is again our usual friends playing their usual games, trying to set countries off against each other and whispering into people's ears and say, work with us, and if you do, it'll all turn out well for you, and you'll become the center of rare earth development in East Asia and an ASEAN colossus or something of that kind. Nonsense, by the way, absolute rubbish. And Hun Sen ought to know better, but he's been around for a very long time, so perhaps his contacts with reality are beginning to dwindle.
Well, this whole temple dispute was partially, at least, caused by the French colonization. When the French left, they gave this temple. I mean, they just claimed that this temple belonged to Cambodia, but at the time, I think Thailand was the one who occupies the temple. So you see, there's immediately problem, right? So just like you said, the usual problem that problem left by the colonialization, and then got worse when the United States came in, to mess things up, stir things up.
Exactly.
Okay. UK and Germany, they are prepared to sign a wide-range mutual defense treaty. And under the pact, they're saying any strategic threat to one country could represent a threat to the other. Well, I thought that was NATO's Article 5 is about.
Exactly. So why not sign another treaty that just says exactly the same as the previous treaty and then the previous treaty before that? in a kind of a way, what this might be saying is that some countries in Europe, Britain and Germany, are starting to think beyond the United States. They're saying to themselves that the United States is perhaps gradually going to quit the scene in Europe, and we've got to think about how we're going to forge our security relationships going forward into the future. You see, the European Union is now busy giving itself a military role, which could also be partly in anticipation of that. But Britain has the problem in that it is outside the EU. So it's trying to forge military ties with the key big EU countries, France and Germany. And that's probably what this is all about.
Can we say they're a little bit scared? Because also during this time, right, that recently the US halts the weapon shipment to Ukraine.
Yeah.
I don't know what's exactly the reason, possibly because they are short on a weapon themselves, because they also supported Israel. And then with this rare earth ban from China, so I don't know whether all these things are connected. But nonetheless, US is halting the weapons shipment to Ukraine. Could that be part of the reason that got them to saying, well, we cannot count on the US, right? That's
I don't think that the decision, the importance of the decision of the US to stop further military supplies for Ukraine, or at least to pause them, the importance of it can be underestimated or overstated. I mean, it is hugely important. Apparently, it was made back in June. I'm going to guess that it was communicated to the various European states over the course of June. I suspect they already knew about it at the time of the NATO meeting. And I think it explains a great deal. Now, just to go to that decision itself, the reason it was made, and it was made before the flare-up in the Middle East, by the way, the conflict with Iran, is because the United States is running into capacity problems. I remember I talked about its problem with producing shells, but it's everything else as well. Patriot air defense interceptors and all of that. And we come back to the governing obsession in the United States. What I always say, everything in the end is about China. The person within the Pentagon who apparently was instrumental in making this decision is Elbridge Colby. And surprise, surprise, what is Elbridge Colby all about? He is the person who says, we must focus on China. Everything that we have, we must focus on China. We're running out of weapons, and such weapons as we still have, we must husband so that we can prepare for our great war with China. This is what the Pentagon is all about. So that obviously cuts off Ukraine, which all of the European leaders now understand. And I think they've gradually coming to realize that open-ended American support for Ukraine is ended, and that the war in Ukraine, therefore, is going to be lost. So they have got to think beyond that, because if the United States is now focused on China and the Indo-Pacific and maybe the Middle East, that means that the Americans aren't here anymore, going to be in Europe so much anymore. So that means in turn that the Europeans need to start thinking about their own security. So they're coming up with all these security agreements. They're coming up with all of these arrangements to build up their military industries, which nobody, by the way, in Europe, I should explain this to people in China, nobody in Europe really believes that's ever going to work. But you have these security agreements being made. And yesterday, Emmanuel Macron finally did the thing which European leaders need to do. He telephoned and spoke to Putin.
okay, good. But what did he say?
Oh, it was an extraordinary meeting. The conversation lasted 2 hours, apparently. 2 hours, longer than any of the calls between Putin and Trump. Briefly, they agreed about the Middle East. They agreed about Iran, and they agreed that they would work together to try to prevent any resumption of conflict between the United States and Iran. And they both agreed implicitly that the attack on Iran was wrong.
Mhm.
And they completely disagreed about Ukraine. But it seems that most of the conversation was about the Middle East.
Well, the Middle East, I mean, they have also been reporting that there are lots of shipments coming from from Europe to Israel,
Yeah.
which make a lot of people speculating that Israel is now preparing, stockpiling, and preparing
Yeah.
the next round. So the
Yes,
ceasefire is
it
very
is.
fragile, right?
It is. I mean, that's exactly what it is. I mean, that's exactly what's happened. What we have is a very, very unstable ceasefire.
Mhm.
I mean, Iran still apparently has its enrichment capability.
Mhm.
At least it has the scientists. It's got the ability to make centrifuges. It perhaps has its uranium stockpile. The IAEA is the door has been shut on it by Iran. So none of the underlying issues have been resolved. The Iranians are refusing to negotiate with the Americans unless they receive guarantees that Israel and the United States are not going to attack Iran again. The Americans probably don't want to give those guarantees. And how reliable would such guarantees be anyway? Nobody knows whether the Iranians will stick to their position that they're not going to acquire nuclear weapons, or whether they could, in fact, press forward with a nuclear weapons program. So, given the uncertainties, there is a very, very high risk, I would say even a probability, that unless something is sorted out and agreed within the next few weeks or months to break this deadlock, that we will have another Israeli attack, an American attack on Iran again. So, we are in a very unstable and unsatisfactory pause at the moment.
You see, um, I find, Trump, before he became the president, he said he wanted this peace deal, he wanted that, ceasefire, he said all these things. There is a very easy way for Trump to do it. If he stopped supporting, countries like Ukraine with
Yeah.
weapons, stop supporting Israel with weapons, and then the fight will all stop. But he can't do that, right?
What do I tell you? What do I tell you, Sophia? That you're too Chinese, that you approach these things in too rational way. You are absolutely right. And if we talk about Iran in particular, the deal, as I've said many times, was there on the table. The
Yeah.
Americans said they don't want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons.
Mhm.
Iran said it didn't want to acquire nuclear weapons. Both sides agreed on the eventual objective. The only problem, therefore, was to come up with mechanisms to achieve it. And those mechanisms would not have been difficult to achieve. You already had the IAEA in Iran. You could have built on that, and you could have arrived at a strong, satisfactory deal, which it must be said would probably have been very similar to the deal you had in 2015, which Trump himself tore up. So, I mean, this is an entirely solvable problem. And we now have a situation, a far worse situation, which is the one I just described, where nobody quite knows. Probably Iran itself doesn't know what it is going to do going forward. So, this is a very, very bad situation. And the attack on Iran, far from resolving anything, has made it much, much worse. Now, I'm going to say something. I think the Iranians do need to start listening to the advice of their friends. Russia has been giving them good advice. China has been giving them good advice. The Chinese and the Russians have told them they're prepared to help. Interestingly enough, I don't know whether you know, but the Iranian defense minister apparently has expressed an interest in the JC-10,
Mhm.
the aircraft that the
Yeah.
Pakistanis had. By all means, so, buy your weapons from China, buy your weapons from Russia, do all of those things. but listen to their advice about your nuclear program. Going nuclear is not in Iran's own best interests, but work with the Chinese and the Russians. They can help you probably to arrive at a good deal. But of course, what the Iranians are going to do is another matter. It's a very, very bad situation. And we should never have been put in this place in the first place. And the reason we are in this terrible situation, first of all, the blame for that rests with Israel, obviously, but also with Donald Trump in the United States.
Well, Iran just did make a one strategic shift that they ditched the GPS and now going
Yeah,
for using the Chinese Baidu
yeah.
for their navigation. The only surprise here is it took Iran this long to do that. You would think that should be the first thing they do, right? They should have done this a month ago. One explanation, lots of discussions in the Chinese media is that within Iran, there is still very strong pro-US kind of factions. So they're not fully unified within Iran. Could that be the problem?
The people in China who are saying that are absolutely right. It has been the besetting problem.
Um,
Um, Iran has always been very reluctant to actually commit fully to strong relations with China and Russia. Now, with Russia, there's reasons for this because Russia and Iran have had a very complicated history with each other. They fought 5 wars, a fact which isn't widely known. The Russians won most of them, by the way. They lost Azerbaijan as a result of those wars. The Soviets invaded Iran alongside the British in the 1940s. They had good reason to. This is during the Second World War, when it looked like Iran might ally with Germany. The Soviets occupied Tehran at the time of the famous Tehran Conference, when Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met, just to say. Anyway, there's been a long history of difficult relations between Russia and Iran. So the Iranians have some reason to be suspicious of the Russians. They have no reason at all to be suspicious of China. They have never had difficult relations with China. But there is a very, very big section of Iranian society that hankers for good relations with the West and sees the entire objective of Iranian foreign policy to get back to normalize relations with the West and to persuade the United States to lift sanctions on Iran. And that has led them, I think, into all kinds of errors. One was to stick with GPS. I mean, they shouldn't have given up on that a few days ago or a few months ago. They should have given up on that years ago. I mean, when the options to actually go for the Chinese system already existed. So that's the first thing. That's one example. But I think this whole business of enriching uranium up to 60% levels in order to try to use that as a bargaining chip with the Americans was always flawed. Because what was the purpose of that bargaining chip? Ultimately, to get the Americans to lift sanctions on Iran. The Americans haven't lifted sanctions on Iran. They've attacked Iran instead. Now, far better for Iran to have worked to develop its relations with the BRICS, to fully commit to the BRICS, to develop strong relations with China, to develop strong relations with Russia too, which is its neighbor, to put aside the bad history that existed there. And I think that the previous Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, understood that. But I think the current one, Pezeshkian, doesn't. I think he still believes that Iran has a future having a good relationship with the United States and with the West. So the result is that Iran has this overcomplicated diplomacy, which leads it into traps which it needs to escape from. And I think the people in China who've made that assessment, once again, are being very insightful and have understood the situation very well.
Isn't that a problem that the Soviet had, right? That Gorbachev and Yeltsin, they all had this idea, even to a certain degree, in the beginning, I think Putin also, they thought they could work closely with the West. Somehow they
Well,
all believe that, right?
I had so many conversations with Russians about this,
Yeah.
and they have come to realize, not all Russians, I mean, there's still a,
Mhm.
minority who think otherwise, but they've come to realize that this has been their constant disaster.
Yeah.
Why did the Soviet Union and China quarrel
Hmm.
in the 1950s and
That's
1960s?
it. Yeah.
It was because Khrushchev sacrificed the alliance with China
Hmm.
in order to achieve better relations with the West. What did that result in? The collapse of the Soviet Union eventually. And I mean, I have to say, in complete fairness, there are many, many people in Russia now who understand that, including within the political
Hmm.
leadership and the political class. And I mean, the one thing that you will always hear them say now is that the quarrel with China was the Soviet Union's biggest mistake. I mean, that was the ultimate cause of everything that went wrong. But you're quite right. Putin still wanted to improve relations with the West. He now understands that that is impossible. The Russians intellectually and mentally have got past that, I think. But in Iran, they haven't. I just want to pass on something which goes exactly back to what those people on the netizens have been saying about Iran. I actually had a discussion about Iran with somebody that I met in St. Petersburg when I was addressing that legal forum. And he was a civilian, I should say. He was not somebody who was from the military. He was Russian. And he said to me that the Russians have had various dealings with Iran over the last 3 or 4 years.
Hmm.
And they have found that Iran is a very difficult country to help.
Hmm.
There's always this issue that somehow doing a deal with you, or indeed with China, or joining the BRICS is second best.
Hmm.
The best would be
Hmm.
improving relations with the US. And of course, firstly, that isn't true anyway.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's no way in which relations with China and Russia are second best. But secondly, I mean, what they imagine in the best is the best isn't even on offer.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. It's not even an option. Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
that's where the problem, I think, countries like Russia,
yeah,
China, I mean, to a certain degree, there are also forces within
yeah,
China want to, get good relationship with the West.
yeah.
Well, the problem, I think, at least China realized, now is that China is simply too big. And the same thing with Russia. Russia is simply too big, too powerful as a country to for the United States to accept, right, to have an equal term because
Exactly.
the US will always feel very uncomfortable to have a
Yes,
powerful Russia or powerful China, right? Always
yes.
be. That's always the problem. But
I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm going to say there is a difference between China's relations with the West and Russia's relations with the West. And this I noticed already, by the way, way back in the 70s when, Nixon came to Beijing and met Mao and Zhou Enlai and all of that, which is the Chinese always have in their relations with the West a tremendous self-confidence,
uh-huh.
which the Russians don't, or at least didn't until very recently.
Okay.
Stalin apparently had it. I mean, he
Uh-huh.
wasn't impressed or afraid of the West at all. But the leaders who came after him did. Khrushchev and
Uh-huh.
Brezhnev and all of them. They were in awe of the West. The Chinese never have been.
Mhm.
And I think this is much, much more widespread within Chinese society because China is this tremendous country with this tremendous history and this enormous cultural self-confidence. And I think that after the Communist Party of China achieved that event, I think
Mhm.
it's called liberation in China, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
The liberation.
After they achieved it, I mean, there's been no turning back. I mean,
Yeah.
they feel again that restored their sense of belief in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they've never really been in awe of the West in the same way, because why should they be?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Russians, much younger country altogether, much less self-confident. They've always been, until very recently, in awe of the Americans, and the Iranians still are.
Well, maybe then we can say that probably the biggest achievement for the Communist Party of China is to bring back confidence
Oh
for
yes, yes.
for the Chinese people. Yeah, that's a
Absolutely.
huge.
I don't think there's any question about this. I absolutely believe that, and that's partly because the leadership of the Communist Party of China, Mao, first and foremost, never lacked that self-confidence, that self-belief in themselves. You look at Khrushchev, and you see his interreactions with the American leaders, and you can see his sense of inferiority. And there's an extraordinary scene where he's arguing with Nixon about who has the better kitchens, Americans or Russians. I mean, ludicrous things. Can you imagine someone like Mao or Zhou Enlai ever getting into an argument with Nixon about something like that?
No, then there's a lot of developing country are trying to copy China. Maybe they can start with self-confidence,
Yeah,
including
absolutely.
Iran,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
So,
absolutely. Well, indeed, absolutely,
yeah.
including Iran. I mean, Iran has had a difficult history too. I mean, it was essentially a protectorate of Russia and Britain during the 19th century. The Russians and the British were dividing Iran into spheres of influence and things of that kind. And then, as I said, it had a very difficult history afterwards. And then after the Second World War, the Americans basically ran everything there. So they have all of these problems to work through. But as you correctly said, they should look at China and look at the self-confidence that the Chinese nation has achieved.
Okay. All right. Always interesting talking to you. So let's talk next
Thank you.
week again.
Absolutely looking forward to it. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.